Broadcasting live from the Business Radio X studios in Atlanta, Georgia, it's time for Atlanta Business Radio, spotlighting the city's best businesses and the people who lead them.
Welcome to this very special edition of Atlanta Business Radio. We are actually broadcasting live from ATDC like we do almost every month. Lee, I just so thoroughly enjoy coming down here, visiting with faculty, with mentors, with startups, and today's going to be no exception, man. We're going to have a lot of fun. Tell us about this first episode.
Well, this episode is an exciting one. Hopefully this is the beginning of something we're going to be doing regularly here. I got with me Jane McCracken. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And Scott Ryan. Welcome.
Hey there. How are you?
And today, this is the brainchild of Jane. She came up with this Take 5, influenced by the Dave Brubeck Quartet back in, this was before your time, 1959 is when that came out, Jane. But I'm sure you heard the song.
It was nice of you to say.
You heard the song Take 5, which the lyrics are, wouldn't it be better not to be so polite? You could offer a light. Just start a little conversation now. It's all right. Just take 5. And that was the inspiration to this themed episode of Taking 5 influences of your life, the entrepreneur's life. So tell me about how you see this playing out over the next year.
Well, the idea is to invite some of the entrepreneurs that are a part of the ATDC's family and asking them to find 5 influences that in their life, people, places, events, pieces of music, books they've read, that have impacted their entrepreneurial journey, and ask them to tell us about it.
And then we're going to put them on the hot seat.
We are.
And then we're going to ask them about the influences and why they are influences in their life.
That's right.
All right. And the guinea pig you got was Scott Ryan.
I do. Scott is one of our entrepreneurs in residence. He is a serial entrepreneur and is the founder and CEO of Mantra Systems. So, Scott, tell us a little bit about Mantra and yourself.
Thanks. So Mantra Solutions is a what I like to call a SaaS-enabled managed IT services provider. So we're in, I guess, the broad category of tech-enabled services, but we help companies that are mid-market size companies. We help them by managing all of their IT infrastructure, helping them migrate to the cloud, set up their security and compliance, all the kind of backroom operations of their IT. We do it in a very unique way, which is kind of what puts the technology stamp on it, I guess, which is we are creating our own SaaS offering that we've developed in-house to deliver these services to our customers. So,
now, what's the pain they're having where they say, you know, we got to call the folks at Mantra?
Yeah, the pain typically they're having is oftentimes it's compliance is kind of one of the big and security in general. Those tend to be the big drivers. The move to the cloud is a big driver for people as well. I mean, generally, there seems to be this attitude sometimes among boards or C-levels within companies that by moving to the cloud, they're going to take all their IT pain away. And really all they're doing is just moving their infrastructure someplace else. There's still all the management of all that IT infrastructure that has to occur. So oftentimes a lot of managed service sales follow on either during a cloud transition or right after it when they realize they still need a lot of help to manage the cloud.
So this is your service comes in while they're deciding to make that initial move to the cloud, or they've already made a move and then it's not working out?
Yeah, both. I mean, if they're forward looking enough, it's happening as they're doing the transition. I think we see right now, we've been in business for about a year, and I would say that the pain points that we're seeing really fall into 3 primary areas right now. One is around compliance related issues. They've got either privacy related or other industry specific compliance concerns like HIPAA or the California Privacy Act. Or GDPR, something like that, that's affecting their business, and they realize that tends to be where most internal IT departments kind of realize that it's beyond their internal capability to handle themselves.
Even though initially they thought they could.
Oftentimes, the compliance, yes, either they thought that they could themselves, or maybe they weren't even aware that they had compliance issues and it was brought up to them by one of their customers. That's one thing we've found. Actually, our very first customer we signed, is a consulting firm. And as happens with many of these compliance frameworks is a major company will have to go to all of their suppliers and force all their suppliers to follow the same compliance concerns. And it got pushed on them, and they turned around and pushed on us, and came to us actually as we signed the contract that that's what they needed. The other big thing that seems to be cropping up quite often is M&A. So we've got 2 clients already that in the process of doing an acquisition or post-acquisition, people often underestimate the amount of work that's required to integrate IT. And we have 2 clients already that came on board. One came in after they did the acquisitions or as the acquisitions were happening, and they needed help getting that done. Another one knew the acquisition was coming, and they brought us on board in preparation for it, knowing that we would be able to help them once that transition was kicking in.
Now, at this stage, are you focusing on specific industries like healthcare, like you mentioned, HIPAA?
Yeah. So I've done, this is my 4th, maybe 5th startup. So I've
haven't gotten right. Still figuring it out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Hey, you sound like my wife. So, every time I've gone into a new startup, I have some definite views about what verticals that we're going to go after. We kind of came into this one and said, and they've always been wrong. Every single time there's always a pivot, multiple pivots. So this time
you started pivoting first.
Exactly. So we just came in with the idea that, rather than make these presumptions about where we think the market is, let's start gathering customers in, and then let's see where the market takes us. Mm-hmm. So we have a few verticals that are beginning to develop. I don't know that any of them are necessarily far enough along that I would think those verticals will be our focus or multiple focus areas that we'll have. What I will say from a horizontal perspective, we're focused on the mid-market. So in the space that we're in of managed IT services, it's a massive industry. It's about a $200 billion industry, but it's very, what I call barbelled market. There's a high end of the market, which is, served by the IBM Global Services, Capgemini, those guys, with a very traditional, outsourcing body mentality. They rebadge employees and bring new people in. And that's really only, the cost points for that kind of reserve yourself to sort of the top 250, companies in the market. And then there's a very low end of the market, which is, it's a 10-person type companies, dentist office or whatever, and the printer's not working, and so don't print until Thursday when the PC guy shows up on Thursday, right? And that's sort of the state of the industry. And there's easily 50,000 companies that do that, none of which ever have the capability or the skill set to ever scale those businesses beyond maybe a couple million in revenue. We think there's a big open area in the mid-market, and that's kind of where we're headed. Companies that have about 100 million in revenue, up to a couple billion in revenue. For example, Paradies Lagardère, which is a big retailer in the airport space. U.S. headquarters based here in Atlanta. They're one of our customers. They're very much in that realm, about 2 billion in revenue. Typically not a complete household name, but a very significant size IT operation, that was doing some M&A, and that's kind of how we got them as a customer earlier this year.
Now, are you working with like private equity firms and VCs to help them make those transitions when they are kind of acquiring?
Exactly. Yep. So, we're working with them for 2 reasons. Initially, right now, we're working with them on these specific opportunities. I can't say that any of them's necessarily panned out as of yet with any new opportunities for us. The other selfish reason for us to be working with them is that we believe that roll-up is roll-up opportunities where you M&A, where you go in and buy a bunch of other companies in the space. Is there's active roll-ups happening right now. We've fundamentally believe the software that we're developing will make roll-ups for us easier. In fact, we've already done our first acquisition, which we did April 1 of this year. We bought a small little managed services company here locally, and that became kind of the first deal to give us some indication of how we're going to do these deals. So I did M&A and investments for EMC for about 2.5 years, for about half of their business. I was on the sourcing side. So I've done a lot of deals and been involved in a lot of deal transactions. So we were able to go from first introduction to closing the deal in 4 weeks, which is lightning fast in the M&A
sure.
realm. So,
and then for the purposes of this show, we're talking about influences. I know you're about to share some of your influences, but talk about the influence of ATDC and how that's come to play in the growth of this company and maybe previous ones.
Yeah, so I've been in and around the ATDC for a long time, longer
before it was cool.
Yeah, is it cool now? Is it?
It's definitely cool now.
Yeah. Okay. So I first, so 20 years ago, I think was the first time I was actually involved with the ATDC. So, I definitely have been kind of influenced by the ATDC pretty significantly in my career over the years. So when I decided to do my first true startup, I'd moved to Atlanta, spun a company out of Nortel where I came to Atlanta to work for. And had spent all my time here on airplanes going to other places because we had about 2,000 employees here at the time, Nortel did in Atlanta. Most of our employees were elsewhere. And so I didn't know anyone here. I knew one person, basically. It was a guy named Stephen Fleming. And when I got ready to leave.
That was a good person to know.
Yeah.
If you were going to pick one.
Yeah, I was picking one. And interestingly, at the time, he was not with the ATDC. He was with a venture capital fund here in town called ATV, not to be confused with other ATVs. And but I reached out to him, and he made some introductions for me, and that's kind of was the beginning. And one of the things he introduced me to was the ATDC, and that was an entity that I should go talk to. And so I started my first company as an ATDC company back then. And
then were all your ventures through here? I know this one now is, and the first one.
Yeah, so they've all been through here in some way, shape, or form, and I've been here as an EIR through multiple tours of duty as well. In fact, I think 2002 was the first time I did, and there were only two of us then. There really wasn't an official program then. In fact, Stephen Fleming was running the ATDC then, and I think it was a little bit of a mercy mission that he gave me the EIR role then. If you remember, 2002 was not the healthiest time in the tech sector. And then I started, so my first company was a company called Encanto, which was a streaming media company in the radio space. And then that was way too early, if you think so. We raised about $20 million for that, and spent about $20 million for that. And I came back here as an EIR, looking to figure out what to build as my next company. So that took a while because that was such a kind of dark days, post bubble burst. But by 2004, I had run into a Georgia Tech professor that had something at Venture Lab. Which is a little bit sometimes a feeder program into the ATDC. That's not officially what it does, but anyway, we then started another company, ATDC company called Asankhya. Asankhya we sold to EMC. I came back here after my days at EMC, started another company called Sonoya Systems, which I ended up selling to Concurrent, which was a micro cap here in Atlanta, and then have come back now to start Mantra. So.
Now, you must be so proud, Jane, to see that kind of, you can't get rid of these people, right?
I know, it's great. And in fact, back in, I think 2015, during one of your stints as an EIR, Scott and I started as entrepreneurs in residence on the same day. So it's kind of nice how cyclical it is, because I was at ATDC 10 years before Scott was. And we are all getting very excited around here because we are coming up for the 40th anniversary of the ATDC. But back in the late 80s, I was also involved with the ATDC, and it's very interesting to see how it continues to evolve and stay relevant to entrepreneurs throughout the decades.
And you can see as part of the DNA, obviously, is a connection that people want to stay connected to it. It's not like, oh, I got it, I don't need you anymore, I'm going to do, you came back here multiple times when, you had a lot of know-how and connections and relationships. You didn't have to come back here, but the value is so high, you wanted to.
Yeah, and I think the needs are different for different people at different stages in their career as well. So, what was helpful for me, the first time around is not necessarily what's helpful for me now. I think a lot of the educational programs and training programs they provide now are probably not as helpful for me, but certainly the networking, the connection to the resources provided by Georgia
talent,
Tech.
Access to talent. I mean, that's relevant
There's really no other place in Atlanta to be able to gain that. And I think it's a unique thing in Atlanta because I've looked in other markets as well, that doesn't exist in the same way in some of the other markets, especially around the Southeast, and certainly in areas up and down the East Coast.
Well, Jane, you ready to put him on the hot seat?
Sure. Let's put him on the hot seat. So name one of the things that has been very influential in your career as an entrepreneur.
Yeah. So Jane, you challenged me with this and to come up with 5. And I will say the first thing is, I don't know if this is the same for everybody, but I have more negative influences potentially to put on the list than positive influences.
I found that too. I found that too.
So what does that mean, a negative influence? Like things don't do this? Or cautionary tales?
Yeah, like I did something or ran into something and it was like, I don't want that again. Right.
Really? That was first.
So I have a few of those, and I left those off the list. I tried to stick with
just the positive,
more positive ones. So just looking across the variety of things, there was a person. I've had one mentor, I think, in my career who kind of stands head and shoulders above other ones, as a guy named Pete Peterson. Interestingly, he's the one. Stephen Fleming knows him as well. If Stephen happens to listen to this, he and I could bond over the fact that we have a mutual admiration for this guy. So, kind of a crusty old guy. So for someone, I come from a traditional educational background, and went back and got my MBA, and I guess have all the standard educational credentials that you would expect, for someone maybe who has followed some of the career stuff that I followed. But Pete was just the opposite. Pete had, I don't even know where he went to college. I know he went to college because Nortel wouldn't have hired him. But then he worked on a oil rig after high school, before college. Told lots of stories about being on oil rigs, and I think in Virginia, of all places, which I didn't even know had him. And then eventually found his way into the tech industry or telecom industry, and he helped launch Nortel into the U.S. market after the breakup of AT&T. And so he was kind of really well renowned, certainly within Nortel, as a marketing leader and just a strategy leader for helping get us in. And he used to know kind of by almost by this by second nature all the things that you go learn in business school. So but then you used to have this translator in your head that you had to work out to be like, what the hell does he mean by that, right? So he used to talk about the rock. So at the time that I interacted with Pete, I had come out of business school. I was in a rotational program with Nortel, and I was doing my first or second rotation was with Pete. So it was my first few months there, and it was just me and about 4 other people. He was in a semi-retirement position by this point. And we were sitting around we were launching a new telephone product. Decided we were going to get into the consumer. Well, here's what we had decided. We had decided that Nortel, if Nortel knew how to build multi-billion-dollar products for massive markets. What we didn't know how to do was build smaller, more innovative products. Maybe went after a small market and then could grow into a big market. So we were trying to reinvent all the processes. This was under John Roth at the time, and so it was a little bit of this reinvention of how we did our processes. So we were just constantly trying to figure out different ways to do stuff. So we were launching a consumer telephone product, and there was about 4 of us working on it, including Pete. And anyway, we were doing some meetings, and he just kept talking about the rock. Well, I don't know if this fits the rock. This is what about the rock? How does it go against the rock? And I kept looking around. No one
knew what that meant.
Well, a couple of the other people in the room knew what it meant. I had no idea what it meant for like an hour. I just kept taking notes, going, okay, well, we'll work on the rock. And anyway, what eventually that was marketing positioning. Is your positioning statement. How that becomes a positioning statement, I know, but that's eventually what it was. And his view was it's the foundation of your product that you test everything else up against. And if it doesn't stick or apply, then it can't be part of the rock. So we had lots of things, and eventually people that knew Pete, you could sort of compare notes about sort of the how you translated what he would say into things that would actually work for anybody else that had a more traditional educational background. So, but Pete was fantastic. I ended up working for Pete for a year and a half. I ended up doing multiple rotations there, stayed in contact with him even after retirement. I think he is now retired in Utah. And so when I've been out there skiing or whatever, I've still got to go see him. And I know a number of others that have done the same. So that's one.
So the person has to be a rock, that we've established that.
And do you keep a rock in each of your companies then? Do you have that foundation?
Well, I will say that there is another term that's not quite, it's funny. We were going through some presentations. We were going to do a presentation for Roth, for John Roth, the guy he was COO at the time, became the CEO. And as we're going through the charts, he just says, "Oh, that's a horse chart." And I was like, okay, great. I don't know
another
what a horse chart is. Yeah. And I'm like looking at it going, there's no animals, there's no horses.
I need more context.
And he's like, do you not know what that is? And so, and I'm like,
called you out.
No. So he stands up and he draws on the whiteboard, he sort of draws a chart. He draws a pretty crude horse and then he labels it horse. And he was like, I didn't need to see the damn word horse to know that that's a horse. That's a horse chart. And I'm like, okay, I get it. It's obvious, I'm stating the obvious in the chart or whatever. So I have used horse chart on people, quite a bit where, they label charts or whatever the obvious, and it, in his own weird sort of way, he influenced a lot of the way we present, the way I present information, even today. So.
Now, any other influences? So that's people. Is there any where do you get your education? Are you like blogs, books? Like what kind of influences you from that standpoint, from an educational standpoint?
Yeah, I do. Well, today, I try to keep myself educated mostly through podcasts and books. Although a lot of the books that I've read recently, I wouldn't necessarily put them in the top 5 of ones. The one book I have in here is from a while ago that was a big influence, which was Insanely Great, that Stephen Levy wrote way back when about the invention of the Mac from back then. That was a book that I had dog-eared and notes all throughout.
What
that
part
book.
of that resonated with you?
I was early in my career at the time in doing product management and, and product marketing. So, what influenced me was, showing that there was an approach to launch, new products in an innovative and creative way within an existing company. So, the processes that I think, like when we look at things like Lean Startup and all these other books and methods, those hadn't been written at the time. So there was very little to go by out there about how to do that.
Kind of a roadmap that it is possible, and this is a way to do it.
This is a way to do it, and this is a way that was obviously done successfully. So, what about you?
What about creatively? Is there an influence creatively that you kind of lean on?
Yeah. So I was actually a theater major undergrad, computer science and theater.
Yeah. I'm sure there was a lot of you, right? A lot of.
It's that left brain, right brain thing.
How many other theater majors you run into in your career?
Almost zero. Unless I'm at the theater and
they might be there watching with you.
Yeah. So I was the only one. So I went to Vanderbilt undergrad, and I was the only computer science theater major there. So maybe not so surprisingly, but I actually started molecular biology and then switched over.
There were too many theater majors there.
Exactly.
There's too crowded.
There's too creative. There's too much creativity going on in virus research. So. Creative influences, and I tend to get from theater, from music. I do try to do that quite a bit, and have throughout my whole career. I think it's provided some advantage for me to be able to continue to.
How do you kind of work that through your organization to get people to think creatively and to not just see the horse, but to go beyond that?
So I've done a variety of things, some successfully, some not successfully over the years, to do that. The funniest one maybe originally was, when we were developing that, consumer telephone product, No Doubt had come out with Tragic Kingdom, and one of the songs on that was Spider Webs, which was basically about people, leaving messages on a phone and, driving them crazy. And that was a little bit about what our product was supposed to do. It was supposed to end that telephony sort of nightmare of being tracked down on your phone. And so I decided to take the MP3 and forward it to everybody else, not realizing that I was one of the only people on the team that actually had broadband at the time. Everybody else was on a dial-up. Why, I don't know. And anyway, I clogged all of their home modems trying to load one song for them. And then when they finally loaded it, they were just pissed off because they're like, I don't understand. Why did you send me a song? Like, what does that have to do with business? And I'm like, oh no, this is like great. I mean, it's actually, clearly a big enough need in the market that people are writing songs about it. So, looking at songs or actually forwarding in a more easier way, I definitely still do that with teams. Recommending books all the time. Usually books that are fiction and or increasingly now stuff that's series or other things that are on Netflix or other sources that people have access to.
Now, are there any kind of events or go-to places that you go for your information? Like in your industry, are there kind of some must-attend?
Well, interestingly, I almost put on my list, I attended 2 TED conferences back when TED was not cool. I think it was TED 9, 10, 11 that I went to. I did that because we were doing some PR work for the company that I was with at the time, and Bob Metcalf, the inventor of Ethernet, had been invited, and we were there shadowing him at the conferences. And it was very cool. Still being run by Richard Saul Warman, who is the founder of the conference. I don't know the guy who runs it now, the British guy that runs it now, took it over after him. And it was still it was less political and more just about technology, entertainment, and design. Right. Yeah, so it was very inspirational to just wander around. I think Dale Chihuly had his stuff at one of them. Wow. And he was still early, before relatively undiscovered at the time. And there were some musicians that were there. All of it just a fantastic kind of environment to be sort of ensconced in. So, the events that there were other events that tried to mimic that were in the tech industry, up to maybe about 15 years ago, and most of them have disappeared. So there was Agenda and Vortex and PC Forum and all these ones where people would meet sort of in the fall to winter to try to predict what the major trends would be for the next year and kind of get together in a small group in that sort of format. And I really do miss those a lot. There's not really anything that's kind of stepped in to replace
Fill that void, right?
Yeah. So, I end up going to a lot of events that are industry related events, but I wouldn't necessarily call them inspirational. They're just there for business purposes.
Have you been to Burning Man?
No, I've not been to Burning Man. I wish I'd gone to the Fire Festival, but
it's not too late. There's still tickets.
Yeah, there are. Yeah. It's still the same experience now as it was back then.
I bring it up because with the guys from Google stepping down, apparently they met Eric Schmidt at Burning Man, of all places. I just find that very interesting. Yeah.
It might have been cool to go to Burning Man 10 years ago or something now. I think it's kind of overdone.
It's over the top.
Yeah. And it's kind of like Coachella now. I mean, it's a C and B scene kind of place as opposed to go get
the spirit
naked
of it,
in the
right. Its genesis was one thing, and now it's kind of devolved into something else.
Yeah.
So now, Jane, is this how you envision this kind of segment going?
Sure. I think there's tons of takeaways that we've been hearing from Scott, and it's so funny. He started out saying that some of the things that influence you as an entrepreneur are things that you learn from, and those aren't necessarily always positive things.
Right.
And certainly they're things that you don't want to repeat. And I know when I was making my list, one of the things that hugely influenced me was I was running an online travel company at the time of 9/11. And while 9/11 is very impactful for everyone who remembers it, when you're running a travel company, we lost 93% of our business overnight.
Right.
Oh.
And you're sitting there. We were a company of 45 people. We were doing $22 million in revenue, and overnight, 93% of it went away.
And it's something that you couldn't have planned for. Even it goes beyond a worst case scenario, right?
No, it does. It does. And you're forced to tap into your resiliency which I feel is something very important that you have to have as an entrepreneur. You had to tap into your leadership capabilities because 44 other employees were looking at me to guide them through this process. You watched the titans in the travel industry at the time start to lay off people. And everyone in our company knew it was only a matter of time before we did it. It took us about 9 months to get back to the revenue rate that we were at. And there were lots of lessons learned along the way. But whenever I refer to it, I don't think an entrepreneur can ever deny that luck and timing has a lot to do with success. And when you are challenged with something like an event that you have absolutely no control over, that totally devastates your business, and you have to find that resiliency to pick yourself up, guide yourself through it, it's something that you tap into and you can learn from. It was a negative thing, but it was hugely influential.
Right, from that point forward. But now when that was happening, was there somebody or was there a person that you could lean on or were you just kind of making this up as you were going along?
Well, amazingly, that bonded all of our employees together in such a way to the point that even though the company's long sold, Travelocity ended up acquiring us, and now Expedia has acquired Travelocity. But once a year, there is still a group of us who still get together because we really bonded over it. And I think some of the themes that come out of that is culture that you build with the team that is helping you build your company and grow your company. It's communication amongst the employees. And it says something to me that a group of us still get together once a year.
Right.
When
that was happening, was it something like everybody knew was happening? So a lot of times in business, things are happening that leadership knows about but everybody else doesn't know about. Now, did that, the fact that everybody knew, did that make it easier to say, hey, we all have to hunker down together and kind of bond, as opposed to an instance where maybe only a handful of people in the organization know something bad is coming or is about to happen, and then would you have communicated differently in that case?
I think you're right. I mean, in that particular instance, everybody knew we were going to have to make some changes. And yes, it did involve some layoffs. We ended up laying off about a third of the staff, so we went down to about 30 people. And everyone took it really, really well, and we did it as a group. Some of that was dictated by HR law in the UK. We happen to be headquartered in the United Kingdom. So some of that and the whole redundancy policy that they have and the employment law that they had dictated some of the path that we followed. But we were bonded as a team of people, and everyone stayed in touch with each other. We worked hard at helping those that had no choice but to be laid off, help them find new jobs and move forward. Fortunately, we were pretty well known as a company. So a lot of people, having had our company, allhotels.com, on their resume, that was very helpful for where they went next.
Mm-hmm. So now that kind of influence, Scott, did you have something like that ever occur in your...
Well, I actually had 9/11 on my list as well. So I was living in Atlanta and jumped on a 6 a.m. flight to go to New York, was there supposed to be there for a conference. And like a lot of other people, got, either stranded up there or just obviously life changed.
So you made it to New York?
I made it to Newark Airport, jumped in the back of a cab. I think I had a BlackBerry at the time, got on my BlackBerry and I'm just sort of, head down looking at email, all that. And, the cabbie was not in a cab, not an Uber. The cab driver was having trouble finding a way to get through one of the tunnels, and so I was like any good backseat driver, telling him which tunnel to take. Yeah, exactly, and what he should do. So we was following my directions and moving around, and we couldn't get anywhere. And I was on the phone with some guy who said, "Hey, something like a Cessna or something hit one of the buildings," because no one was really sure what totally had happened yet.
And the Cessna did hit a building like in that time frame.
Oh, around that time frame. Yeah. So it was, anyway, eventually the guy, the cab driver had a TV that he was, watching while he was driving and lifted it up and showed it to me. And it was like the island's
And you
closed.
were in the tunnel?
We were in a line trying to get to, so is the Lincoln Tunnel is the one that's further south, or the Holland Tunnel? Whichever one was further south. We were basically in line to get there, because when he finally pointed the TV, then he pointed to the windshield, and I looked up, and the towers are on fire in front of us.
Wow.
First tower was on fire. And I was like, I don't think I'm going to get on the island at this point. So we were near Hoboken, Jersey City, and all that. And it was interesting how fast everything happened after that, because I was like, well, just get me to a hotel. I'll figure it out. Get me to some sort of Marriott, because I knew I could probably get into one of those. And as we were in Jersey City, and as we passed a Marriott, and as he was going to do a U-turn, there were military trucks coming and blocking off every turn, and we were trying to get ahead of them so that we could get a U-turn before the next one blocked off the middle of the road. And then he dropped me off, and then we were just right down there, close to everything going on. So I got stuck there for about 3 days, and well, you mentioned resiliency, which is one of the words I had written down about this, because I had nothing but, myself, my wife and kids were here. It's kind of crystallizes in your mind kind of what's important.
Right.
And there was no work really to get done for a couple of days. So other than just sitting around a hotel room and thinking about your life and thinking about, why am I up here? What's important? And anyway, I eventually figured out that there were a bunch of rental cars at Newark, because no one had come in to pick up their rental cars for the day.
So you drove back?
Drove back, actually picked up my wife's cousin in D.C., so drove by the Pentagon
pick
got
the whole tour.
Oh, yeah. Got the whole 9/11 tour, and then came home that way. So but I think and that whole, during the bubble burst period, because that all was within a few months of each other, right? So that whole time frame was for me kind of a make it or break it, like questioning, is this what I'm going to go do the rest of my life? Because a lot of people just stepped away from the industry then. And I spent quite a bit of self reflection, soul searching, locking myself in a room and just curling up into a fetal position for a while, quite honestly, and trying to figure out what I was going to do. And eventually, after a few days, sort of emerged kind of a changed person after that. But I think with a lot more, personal resiliency and grit, coming out of that could have broken me the other way, I guess. But I think fortunately went in a positive direction, I think, for me, and with a very negative sort of influence.
Exactly.
So.
And those kind of challenges happen to everybody throughout their life in different ways, and people, deal with them, like you said. And some people left the industry and, they're doing something else. And some people said, you know what, I'm going to build on this. And it can bring a group together. So
it can.
I mean, out of adversity, a lot of times some good can come of it. So now in this kind of segment going forward, Jane, how do you see this playing out? Like, we're going to get some entrepreneurs and put them in this kind of hot seat, and then kind of.
Yeah, I think it gives everybody a chance to think about people, books, activities, events that have really influenced you as an entrepreneur, because every step along the journey changes the way you do things, maybe forces you to pivot, forces to give you a pause, and you do a lot of reflection, and the whole resiliency thing again.
And I think an important component of it is that, and a lot of times leadership especially feels like it's just them. They're alone in this, and they're really not alone. There are people influencing, there are people supporting and celebrating and helping them achieve their goals.
Often around here or in the lunches that we have with some of the CEOs getting together, we share which books have been influential with us. You mentioned the book that was influential to you. An old one that I still recommend to people is How to Win Friends and Influence People. And that has been around for a long time. And especially
it was on stone tablets, I think, in the
yeah,
original version.
It was, yeah. But there's a whole section in that book about getting people to come around to your point of view. And as you're leading people and trying to pull an entrepreneurial company through its life stages, you've got to pull that team through. You've got to get that teamwork going. and everybody's got to get together on the same page. So I think that book is always a good one for people to read.
And I think in books and podcasts and blogs, like you mentioned, those are mentors in a way. You know, the mentor doesn't have to be in front of you or on the phone. You can get mentoring in a lot of different ways.
That's right.
You can get it from a lot of different sources too. And then I won't go into the full story, but one of the influences I put in there in my top 5 was a job that I had at a video store in high school. Excuse me. And the way I got the job is I won a video game contest. And the video game contest had a 1-hour time limit on it. And the big learning was I came in to get my 1-hour time slot to play the game. They did it in the store. This is on the old Atari 2600, to date myself, a game called Laser Blast. And the way the game worked, it was, one of these games where you figure out a repeating pattern, and if you get the pattern right, you don't lose any ships or whatever. So I practiced, and no matter what you did in an hour, you got to about 200,000 points. And so I turned the game off and got ready to go to bed, and I was just laying in bed because my slot was the next morning, and realizing everybody's going to figure this pattern out. So like sometimes it was 200, sometimes it was 205, whatever, but everybody's going to be at the same spot. So I got back up and I was like, I got to figure out. There was another pattern where I was losing ships that maybe I can do that pattern, but I never went far enough with it because it wasn't a perfect, lossless, pattern. So I started doing this other one where every few screens you would lose a couple of ships, and realized that I was gaining more ships at a faster rate than I was losing. And when I finished at an hour, I finished at 400,000 points.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So came the next day, the guy who owned the place was like, yeah, good luck,
right?
Yeah, we got the best ones are 200. You're not going to hit that. So, I was hoping that you would win. I mean, you just gave me this whole real downer thing. Well, I start up and I'm about halfway in. I hit 200 at about halfway in, and he looks over my shoulder and he's like, "What time did you start?" And anyway, I hit 400, and they were amazed. And what influenced me in that whole thing was that perfection is not necessarily the best strategy, right? Just acceptable losses is actually the right way to look at a lot of the things.
And trust the chaos a little bit. It doesn't have to be the perfect path that we're all searching for. Just the path could be good enough, and we can meander around. That's okay.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where it was just some video game. You still was able to learn a lesson from it that I've taken into business since then. So, in a lot of different ways.
Good stuff. Well, if somebody wants to learn more about Mantra, what's the coordinates?
We are at mantra.io, or just search for Mantra Solutions, and you'll reach us.
And then, Jane, if somebody wanted to get involved with ATDC?
We'd love to hear from them, and just send an email to info@atdc.org.
And atdc.org is the place where all the events, all the learning, they can find a lot of resources there as well.
That's right.
Well, thank you both for sharing your stories today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right, this is Lee Cantor for Stone Payton. We will see you all next time on ATDC Radio.